For a moment, it looked like just another clip in the endless stream of sermon snippets that flood social media every day. A few seconds, a strong statement, a reaction shot, and suddenly timelines were filled with speculation, commentary, and side-taking. But what followed turned that brief moment into something much larger. Pastor Todd firing back at Furtick after a viral clip was not just a response to a misinterpretation or a disagreement over words. It felt like a pressure release in a space where tension has been quietly building for years. A space where influence, style, and theology intersect under the unforgiving spotlight of the internet. To understand why this moment landed so hard, you have to understand how both men are positioned in modern church culture. They are not fringe voices. They represent a new generation of pastors whose reach extends far beyond the walls of their churches. Their sermons are edited, shared, debated, and sometimes weaponized by people who have never stepped foot inside their congregations. Every phrase is treated like a manifesto, every pause like a strategy. In that environment, silence can be interpreted as weakness, and response can be seen as escalation. Pastor Todd choosing to respond changed the dynamic immediately. The viral clip at the center of the controversy was brief, but its impact was amplified by context stripping. Words meant for a specific audience, delivered in a specific moment, were pulled into a broader arena where nuance rarely survives. Viewers projected intent, critics assigned motives, and supporters rushed to defend. For days, the conversation grew without direct clarification, allowing speculation to harden into assumption. When Furtick's name became attached to the discourse, whether intentionally or not, the stakes rose. Suddenly, this was no longer about a sermon moment. It was about perceived authority, influence, and who gets to define the narrative. Pastor Todd's response mattered because it broke a familiar pattern. Often, leaders either ignore viral criticism entirely or address it indirectly through carefully worded messages that avoid naming the tension. This time, the response felt more direct, more human, and less filtered. It carried the weight of someone who understands the cost of being constantly misunderstood online and who is no longer willing to let others finish his sentences for him. That tone resonated with supporters who have watched him absorb criticism for years without visible pushback. At the same time, the response unsettled others. Some interpreted it as defensiveness. Others saw it as necessary boundary setting. This split reaction reveals something important about the audience consuming this story. They are not simply looking for right or wrong. They are negotiating their own discomfort with confrontation in spiritual spaces. Many grew up in church environments where public disagreement between leaders was rare or hidden. Seeing it surface openly feels jarring, even if it feels honest. What makes this moment especially compelling is the contrast between intention and interpretation. Pastor Todd's ministry has always leaned heavily into vulnerability, relatability, and emotional honesty. That approach draws people in, but it also invites scrutiny. Critics often frame his style as performance-driven, while supporters see it as accessible and real. When a clip goes viral, those existing biases shape how it is received. A response, then, is not just to the clip itself, but to years of accumulated perception. The fire in Pastor Todd's words did not come across as reckless anger. It came across as frustration shaped by repetition. Repetition of being quoted out of context. Repetition of being compared to peers in ways that flatten individuality. Repetition of having theological depth reduced to sound bites. When he addressed the situation, he was not only responding to Furtick or to critics. He was responding to the system that thrives on conflict and confusion. This is where the story widens beyond two names. It becomes about how modern faith leaders navigate visibility. The same platforms that allow messages to reach millions also invite constant judgment. Every response is evaluated not only for truth, but for tone. Too soft, and it feels evasive. Too strong, and it feels combative. Pastor Todd's decision to fire back walks that tightrope, and the audience watches closely to see whether he falls or finds balance. As the clip of his response circulated, reactions multiplied. Some praised the clarity, others questioned the necessity. Many simply leaned in, sensing that something deeper was being revealed. This was not just about disagreement, it was about exhaustion. Exhaustion from being reduced to moments, exhaustion from having intentions rewritten by strangers, exhaustion from carrying influence without control over interpretation. By the end of this first phase, one thing is clear. This moment did not emerge randomly, and it will not fade quietly. It has tapped into a broader conversation about voice, respect, and accountability in an age where every word can be replayed endlessly. The response has shifted the energy, setting the stage for deeper examination of what leadership looks like when the audience is global, instant, and rarely forgiving. As the reaction spread, the conversation began to reveal just how much unresolved tension exists beneath the surface of modern church leadership. What initially appeared to be a personal moment between two influential pastors quickly turned into a referendum on style, authority, and legitimacy. People were not just asking what Pastor Mike Todd meant. They were asking who gets to speak with authority in this era, and whether influence itself has become a point of rivalry rather than responsibility. That shift in focus is what keeps the story alive. For many observers, the comparison between Mike Todd and Stephen Furtick was unavoidable, even if neither man explicitly framed it that way. Both represent churches that grew rapidly by speaking the language of a digital generation. Both are known for creative communication, emotional storytelling, and messages designed to connect beyond traditional church culture. Yet their approaches feel different enough that audiences often project competition onto them, even when none is stated. That projection fuels narratives the leaders themselves do not control. The viral clip that ignited the debate became a canvas onto which people painted their assumptions. Some assumed theological disagreement, others assumed ego. Still others assumed calculated branding. These assumptions say as much about the audience as they do about the leaders involved. In a culture accustomed to public feuds and influencer clashes, viewers are primed to expect escalation. When faith leaders enter that same ecosystem, they inherit its expectations, whether they want them or not. Pastor Mike Todd's response disrupted that expectation by refusing to play entirely by those rules. Rather than offering a sanitized explanation or a passive spiritual deflection, he addressed the emotional reality of being constantly interpreted by people who only see fragments. That honesty resonated deeply with a generation that values transparency, even when it is uncomfortable. It also challenged older expectations of pastoral restraint, creating friction across age and tradition lines. This moment also highlights the burden of proximity. When leaders share openly, they feel closer to their audience. That closeness can foster trust, but it can also invite entitlement. Some viewers begin to feel they deserve explanations, access, and alignment on demand. Pastor Mike Todd's response subtly pushed back against that entitlement, reminding audiences that visibility does not erase boundaries. That reminder unsettled some, because it reasserted distance where people had grown accustomed to familiarity. Meanwhile, Stephen Furtick's perceived role in the situation added another layer of complexity. Even without a direct exchange, his name carries weight. Years of visibility have turned him into a reference point for conversations about modern church growth, influence, and criticism. When his name surfaced in the discourse, it activated long-standing debates that predated this moment. In that sense, the clash was never just between two individuals. It was between interpretations of what modern ministry should look like. As commentary intensified, a pattern emerged. Supporters of each leader framed the situation as a defense of authenticity. Critics framed it as proof of ego. Neutral observers framed it as inevitable friction in a crowded space of influence. These competing frames coexisted, ensuring that no single narrative dominated. That multiplicity is exactly what platforms reward. Ambiguity fuels engagement, and engagement fuels visibility. What often gets lost in that cycle is the human cost. Pastor Mike Todd's response carried hints of weariness that many recognized. Weariness from being reduced to controversy. Weariness from watching sincere effort reframed as performance. Weariness from knowing that any response will be dissected, regardless of intent. That emotional undercurrent is what gave the moment depth beyond surface drama. The story also exposes how quickly spiritual language can be repurposed for debate. Words meant to encourage can become evidence in arguments. Sermons meant to heal can become ammunition. In responding, Pastor Mike Todd was not just defending himself. He was pushing back against a culture that treats faith content as endlessly malleable for reaction. That pushback complicates the narrative because it challenges the very system distributing the story. By this point, the audience is no longer just reacting to a clip. They are reacting to the implications. If leaders respond openly, are they expected to do so every time? If they remain silent, are they assumed guilty? There is no winning formula, only trade-offs. Pastor Mike Todd's choice illuminates that dilemma, making it visible rather than theoretical. As attention builds, the conversation naturally shifts toward consequence. Will this response change how future moments are handled? Will it encourage more direct engagement or caution leaders against speaking at all? Those questions linger because they reflect uncertainty about the future of public faith leadership itself. By the end of this section, it becomes clear that the fire in Pastor Mike Todd's response is not about dominance or rivalry. It is about reclaiming voice in an environment that constantly speaks over its subjects. That reclamation does not end debate. It intensifies it. And in doing so, it prepares the ground for a final reckoning about what audiences truly want from the leaders they elevate, critique, and consume every day. By the time the conversation reaches this stage, the focus shifts from the moment itself to what it reveals about the ecosystem surrounding it. Pastor Mike Todd firing back is no longer just a reaction to a viral clip or perceived shade. It becomes a mirror held up to how modern audiences consume faith, leadership, and conflict. The speed at which interpretations solidified exposed how little patience exists for complexity and how quickly narratives are constructed without full context. In that sense, the response did more than address a controversy. It exposed the machinery behind it. One of the most striking elements is how quickly intention becomes irrelevant online. Once a clip goes viral, meaning is crowdsourced. People who have never listened to a full sermon, never engaged the broader theology, and never interacted with the leader personally feel confident rendering verdicts. Pastor Mike Todd's response pushes against that dynamic by asserting that intention still matters, even when interpretation spins out of control. That assertion challenges the idea that creators must surrender ownership of their message the moment it leaves their mouth. This is where tension deepens. Audiences want authenticity, but they also want control. They celebrate vulnerability, but only when it aligns with their expectations. When a leader expresses frustration, sets boundaries, or defends themselves, that authenticity is suddenly questioned. Pastor Mike Todd's response confronts that contradiction head-on. It asks whether authenticity is truly desired or whether it is only welcomed when it confirms existing opinions. The reaction also reveals how leadership is often flattened into archetypes. Mike Todd becomes the emotional pastor. Furtick becomes the polished communicator. These simplified identities make it easier to take sides, but they erase nuance. The viral moment fed those archetypes, while the response complicated them. Complication is risky, because it demands more effort from the audience, yet it is also where growth happens both for leaders and for those who follow them. Another important layer is the role of comparison culture. Even when leaders do not compare themselves, audiences do. Metrics, reach, influence, and style become points of rivalry by proxy. Pastor Mike Todd's response implicitly resists that comparison by refusing to define himself against someone else's ministry. Instead, he speaks from his own experience, his own fatigue, and his own convictions. That refusal is subtle but significant. It redirects the conversation away from competition and back toward calling. As days pass and commentary continues, some begin to notice what is absent. There is no prolonged back and forth, no escalating feud, no attempt to dominate the narrative through constant updates. That restraint reframes the fire and the response is controlled rather than reactive. It suggests that the goal was not to win a public argument, but to mark a line. Once that line is drawn, continuing to fight would only blur it. The broader implication is uncomfortable for audiences accustomed to perpetual access. It suggests that leaders are allowed to speak once and move on, that they do not owe endless explanations, that they can assert clarity without submitting to interrogation. This idea clashes with a culture built on constant engagement, where silence after speaking is often interpreted as retreat. In this case, silence may simply be resolution. Emotionally, this moment resonates because many viewers see themselves in it. They recognize the feeling of being misunderstood repeatedly, of watching others define them through fragments, of wanting to speak not to convince everyone but to reclaim self-understanding. Pastor Mike Todd's response becomes relatable not because of its theology, but because of its humanity. That relatability is what keeps the story circulating beyond church audiences. At the same time, the moment forces a reckoning about accountability. Critics argue that influence demands explanation. Supporters argue that influence also deserves empathy. Both positions hold truth. The tension lies in how accountability is practiced. Is it an ongoing conversation rooted in relationship, or a public spectacle driven by clicks? Pastor Mike Todd's response leans toward the former, even as it unfolds within the latter. This duality is what makes the story linger. It refuses to settle neatly. It resists simple moral framing. Instead, it leaves viewers with questions about their own role in the cycle. Are they seeking understanding or validation? Are they listening or waiting to react? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are necessary if the culture surrounding faith leadership is to mature. By the end of this section, the narrative has evolved from reaction to reflection. The fire has burned through the surface drama, revealing deeper issues about voice, ownership, and the cost of constant visibility. Pastor Mike Todd's response does not close the conversation, it elevates it, and in doing so it sets the stage for a final examination of what this moment means not just for two pastors, but for the future of leadership in an age where every word lives forever. As the final chapter unfolds, the meaning of this moment settles into something quieter but more enduring. The noise fades, the clips slow down, and what remains is a question that cannot be answered with likes or comments. What kind of leaders do audiences actually want? And what kind of audiences are they becoming in the process of watching, reacting, and demanding more? Pastor Mike Todd firing back ultimately forces that reflection, not through spectacle, but through restraint that follows intensity. What stands out in hindsight is not the heat of the response, but the discipline after it. There is no prolonged campaign to justify himself, no attempt to capitalize on the attention by feeding the cycle. That choice matters. It signals that the response was not about dominating a narrative, but about correcting one moment and then returning to purpose. In an ecosystem that rewards constant engagement, stepping back can be more disruptive than shouting louder. It denies the algorithm its preferred fuel. This restraint reframes leadership as something steadier than the internet allows it to appear. It suggests that leaders can speak firmly without living inside the conflict they address. That idea challenges audiences who have been trained to expect escalation. It also challenges critics who assume that silence after speaking implies weakness. In this case, silence looks more like confidence, a refusal to be pulled into endless clarification that satisfies no one and erodes focus. The broader takeaway is about maturity on both sides of the screen. Leaders must learn how to engage without being consumed, and audiences must learn how to listen without demanding access to every thought and motive. Pastor Mike Todd's response offers a glimpse of that balance, imperfect but intentional. It does not ask for agreement, it asks for consideration. That distinction is rare, and it is why the moment lingers. This episode also reveals how much faith discourse has been shaped by media habits rather than spiritual ones. Speed, certainty, and spectacle dominate, while patience, nuance, and grace struggle for space. When a leader disrupts that pattern, even briefly, it feels uncomfortable. That discomfort is not a sign of failure. It is a sign that expectations are being challenged. Growth often begins there. As viewers step back, some will remain critical, others supportive, and many somewhere in between. That diversity of response is not a flaw in the moment. It is evidence of its depth. Shallow controversies burn out quickly. This one endures because it touches something real, the strain of leading authentically in public, and the strain of following without turning people into symbols rather than humans. In the end, Pastor Mike Todd firing back is less about Stephen Furtick or a viral clip and more about reclaiming voice in a system that often strips it away. It is about reminding audiences that leaders are not characters in a story written by strangers, but people navigating calling, criticism, and consequence in real time. That reminder does not resolve every tension, but it grounds the conversation in reality. At 3,500 words, the story closes without a verdict, and that may be its greatest strength. It leaves space for reflection rather than reaction, for discernment rather than division. The moment stands not as a feud but as a signal that boundaries, clarity, and humanity still matter, even in environments that profit from confusion. Whether audiences honor that signal will shape not just future controversies, but the health of the conversations that surround faith, leadership, and influence moving forward.